Hey, welcome to Lab the podcast. Excited to share some time with my friend Shanna Zamparas. Shanna holds a master's of music and piano performance and sacred studies from the University of Florida, as well as a bachelor's of music and piano performance from the University of Tampa. She's performed solo and chamber works and master classes in international festivals from Europe and in Europe and Greece. Shauna currently works full-time as a piano teacher at Lakeland Christian School and continues to perform solo piano works across the US and Europe. Shauna is passionate about worship music and began her studies in piano with the intent of becoming a church pianist. She currently serves as a creative director and conservatory artist for VUVIVO Ministry, monthly worship nights, and continues to serve on worship teams in churches across Tampa Bay. Her solo vocal and piano album, Always Enough, is available on all streaming platforms. She also enjoys performing in a piano duo with her husband, concert pianist and professor of music, Gregorios Zamparas. That's so much. Like, I know you as Shauna, and then I get to read all of that, and I'm like, wow, absolutely. You're like an international touring musician. Shauna, it's
Oh
so
my
good to hang out
goodness.
with you.
So good to be here. I'm so excited. Thank you so much for having me.
What's important, I think we've been kind of having these conversations along the way
Mm,
behind the scenes going, how do we create space for people to get to know the team at V3? I mentioned like
mhm,
VUVIVO conservatory artists. It's like a big title. We refer to you and to Megan, to Wendy as V3 artists,
mm,
and people get to hear a lot from Wendy. But there are so many other artists that are part of V3's team, and these spaces are here. And Riley actually and I have talked about how do we create space for the whole team to get introduced to our lab audience. So thank you for making time. And it's awesome for people to get to know you personally and not just as a V3 artist, because your music has impacted all of us. Your gift has impacted so many people who will hear this podcast, but we don't always get to know the person behind that person who's leading worship or performing. So this is really,
right.
really special.
Mm. Well, thank you. I mean, it's just such an honor to be here. And I honestly was blown away to even be invited to be interviewed. I love the ministry and I love being a part of V3. And I've been listening to the podcast now for a little while. So to hear different voices and to be like, okay, here's mine as well. I'm so honored to share and very, very excited.
Yeah. We started this whole project with the idea that, V3 wants to wondrously reveal Christianity and
Mm,
invite people to know God personally. We do it through art, we do it through music, we do it through literature and content, immersive experiences. There's all these ways that V3 is trying to hold out the hope of the gospel.
mm,
And this podcast started with us going, wouldn't it be cool if we could point to places where you see the life and beauty of the gospel springing up in people, in their life, in their work? So, whether it's a thought leader or an author or a professor, we're looking at that in all different ways. Or it's people who their life is that remarkably ordinary place, as Buechner says, where the gospel springs up.
mm,
And then artists play a particular role in V3's work to
mm.
wondrously reveal Christianity and hold out the hope of the gospel so people can know God personally. That's kind of where I want to steer the conversation. I want to start with your background as an artist, because everybody says that, like, I know my cousin's in a band, or you're right, I've got an artist, and we all are. But there's also people who have given their life to
Mm,
studying. And I just mentioned in your bio, you just finished a master's program at UF. Why UF, first of all? What was it about UF's program that made you say that's the highest and best for right now for what I'm
right.
studying?
So UF was, I think to some, it could be considered a very unique choice. But for me personally, I really enjoyed my time in visiting UF and actually getting to know the professor ahead of time. And that's how I kind of made my decision. I met a couple of professors, mostly in the area because I'm from Tampa. And of course, UF is one of the biggest schools in Florida, and I've heard a lot about it. Um, but the music program, I wasn't really aware of it until I was studying at University of Tampa, and I heard about this pianist that was teaching there, Dr. Jasmine Arakawa. So I went. I had a piano lesson with her, and she's from Japan. and just the sweetest lady with a most incredible heart. And her talent is just incredible, absolutely amazing. And I had a lesson with her and I was like, this is it. And we just meshed so well. And I think as a pianist, especially a solo artist, the teacher has so much to do with the study and where you choose to
Sure.
study. And so a lot of people will do that when they're making that decision on where to go to school is who will I be studying with personally? And so when I met her, I was like, this is it. And I prayed a lot about it. And I really do feel like God led me there specifically. And the sacred studies part of my degree was something I actually added later on because initially when I went, I just wanted to focus on pedagogy. So teaching, because that's my passion. I love teaching. I love performing, but I really, really love teaching. I'm the most passionate about teaching. And looking at the program there, they had some solid teachers in that area. And I wasn't expecting sacred studies to come on the radar until I started studying there. And I met Dr. Laura Ellis, who is the organ professor there and also gives classes in sacred studies. So when I saw that, of course, the two worlds kind of meshed, and I'm like teaching and sacred studies. So I did some coursework in hymnody and sacred music specifically. And there's so much out there when it comes to that topic. And I was just so excited to be able to add that to my degree. So I think it all was a blessing, and I think God specifically put me there for a reason.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you think about prestigious universities, there's a lot of great universities, and UF is known for a lot of things, especially in the Southeast. People respect that institution for
Mhm, for
so many
sure.
reasons. But we wouldn't know Sacred Studies program in music is a part of that. But
Right.
it's cool to hear the work that's being done. And for you as an artist, that the opportunity to study at that level. Uh, and do it here. That's pretty great. And you started in Tampa at the University of Tampa.
Mhm.
We'll come back to that. Who was your first piano teacher though? Like go
Of
all the
all
way back. Yeah,
time.
of
Oh
all
my
time, if you
goodness.
can remember.
I do remember.
Okay.
I think as a pianist, your piano teachers,
They matter.
they are yes, they play such a pivotal role, especially when piano becomes something you study, um, later on. So my first piano teacher, her name was Kathy Starnes. She was this redheaded woman. I remember her as this very fiery teacher who was very strict. She made my little sister cry in lessons, which was hilarious. But I think to me, I was just, I mean, studying with her was very inspiring because I would watch her play and
Mm,
her fingers just went so fast. And she was very strict, and for a good reason. She was a very good teacher. She didn't mean to make my sister cry, to go back to that. She just was a very strict
sure.
teacher, and I think that it's challenging when you're young, and I started piano lessons when I was 8 years old. My sister was 7, very, very young, and, we had her come to the house, and she taught us, and I remember that first piano recital, she performed a lot, and she introduced the different, periods of music. So she started with Baroque period, and then she played a Baroque piece, and then she had some of her students play Baroque music, and then she went to the classical period, she played a classical piece,
Mm,
and then we played and the same with Romantic and on to Contemporary. So she went through, the different, periods of music and showed us, what we could potentially one day play, and that was very inspiring.
yeah.
So
Yeah. I want to try to draw that thread, right? Eight
mm,
years old, you knew someone knew that you had a gift or you had a passion.
mm,
Was it more you or was it someone else, a parent or somebody who said, you're going to go to piano lessons? That's the way it was for me. I think I did love music and I wanted to play, but
right.
I was not disciplined. My teacher made she wants your hands to be like that and the
Right,
hand. So she
right.
was very strict like that too. And I didn't love that
Mm,
and I gave up too soon.
mm.
Did you want it and say, "Get me piano lessons," or did somebody see a gift and say, "We need to get you piano lessons"?
So I would say a little of both because we were homeschooled. So I grew up in a very large family. I'm the oldest of 10 children. There's 5 girls, 5 boys. And my parents were like, this is part of your education. You're all going to, as much as we can, get you piano lessons. We will. It ended up being mostly for the first 5 because piano lessons can get expensive. But us older ones ended up teaching the younger ones as they grew up. But for me, I think initially we had a piano in the house, and
Yeah.
that's something my parents really wanted us to be exposed to was to have an instrument there. So already there was a piano. We would just jump on it as kids and play around, and I just had so much fun playing, and I would play a little bit by ear. I'd play songs that I heard on TV or that I'd heard in church and just pick them out by ear. And so that's how I started. I just loved getting on the piano and picking out melodies. And so, of course, my parents wanted me to take lessons, but I also wanted it as well. I think the passion for it came probably after I started playing. And I really was inspired by one piano teacher in particular, who, when I was 12 years old, she had given me hymns. She had started to teach me hymns from the hymn book. And she was like, Shauna, at age 12, she was like, I think you're going to be a church pianist. You could definitely do that. And when she said those words, I almost felt prophetic to me.
Mm.
It felt like, okay, this is going to happen. When she said that, I was like, oh, I could be a church pianist. And I think from that moment, that's what I wanted was just to play for church. And I started playing through the hymnal. I had this goal, like as a 12-year-old, to learn every hymn in the hymnal, which
Awesome.
never came to fruition because I gave up after like number 12 or something.
Sure.
But I would still play through the hymnal. But having a teacher, speak those words and believe in a way that this you can do this, it was very, very inspiring. And so I took that, and even at that age, I would get on the piano and play and sing and use that as a time of worship. I mean, even as a young child, I remember that being just very special. If I was feeling a lot of emotion, I would get on the piano and just play and sing to the Lord, and I would feel so calmed and um, had such a sweet communion in those times. And so, yeah.
Yeah. I love just the idea that parents do play a role
Mhm.
in even putting a piano in the house. Remember us talking about that I can't even remember the period of history, but it was like every home in America had a piano. That was kind of or almost every home. It was just prolific that you would have a piano and that was part of how you entertained as a family.
For
And then as
sure.
culture changed, that went away. But families who have had a piano in the home, I think so many of us remember going and trying it, or there was one sibling who was really gifted and kind of had an ear for it.
Mhm.
And I think that's a lot of our story. And then some people find their way to church, they play at church, some people get serious about it. You stayed with it
Mhm.
and not only took lessons and began to play at church, but then had a moment where you were deciding to go to the University of Tampa. You
Mm.
had to choose, like, am I going to put resource behind higher ed
Right.
and music? And I'm sure in the background you were thinking, I don't know if I can find a job as a church pianist that's going to pay. How did you make that decision? And was that still the aim when you enrolled at UT that you were going to use your gift and direct it toward the church? Or had you started to think, well, I'll make a living
Mm.
with music? And if so, kind of what was your imagination around that?
It's a very good question. So, I think initially, in my teens, I had some teachers because I didn't have just one teacher growing up. Things would happen, and a teacher would get married or have a child, and then I would have a different teacher. And but as a teenager, one of my teachers was a church pianist who had gone to, I think it was Bob Jones for a music degree. And so she even asked me, do you want to pursue music at the higher education level? And at that age, I really didn't want to. I was scared about that because you have to memorize all this repertoire, you have to give recitals, and the recitals are often upwards of an hour of memorized music. And that's just how piano performance is. And that made me very, very nervous. And I was like, no, I think I'll just stick with the hymns and playing in church, even though the classical music for me was also very inspiring and exciting, especially at that age. I loved Bach, and the preludes and fugues were just so exciting to play. But, my teacher said, okay, we'll just stick with this. Well, after that, I got into my 20s. I was playing for different worship events and always had some piano students. But when they would get to a certain level, I would kind of be like, okay, I have to pass you off to someone who's a little bit more experienced. Um, and I had different jobs. When I entered my early 30s, I still had a few students, but my studio was growing and I
Mm,
had more and more and more. I was like, wow, I really want to be able to teach my students well.
mm,
And I knew that I had a limit with the level of education that I'd had. And I had a fellow teacher at a music academy in Tampa where I was teaching who said, Shauna, I really think you should go get your degree. Like she just brought that up to me. And I was like, at my age, like going back to school, getting a music degree of all degrees to go back to
yeah,
school
sure.
for feels like it's past time to do that. I don't know if I could even start to think about that. But she was like, I will help you. And
Wow.
we and she was just the most incredible cheerleader.
Mm,
She stood by me the whole way. She helped me with repertoire. Um and she had been to school in New York. She had gotten her master's there. I can't remember what school at the moment, but she just inspired me so much. So I started at the community college level. I went for 2 years, studied with Ken Hanks, and then went transferred into University of Tampa for 2 years, and then on to UF for 2 more years. And by the end of it, I was like, wow, I can't believe that God brought me this whole way because learning that much repertoire, playing full sonatas that I hadn't even played in my
mm,
teens, it was a stretch.
yeah,
But I feel like God used it in my teaching and even in worship music, but also to open a door in classical music to see how that can even be used to worship Him. Not just music that's
sure,
designated worship music.
sure.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that's one of the hopes for V3. Like,
Mm,
it's the idea that beauty points beyond itself,
mm,
and we don't have to name it a certain thing. Beauty does point, and
mm,
it is a God-given gift. And so when it's aimed rightly, the source of it and the aim of it are both and can be both. Um, Not explicitly worship music, and they're still explicitly pointing to God, right?
for sure.
And that's part of the dream, right? And I think this is what's so important about capturing like the march towards professional, like high level education and excellence in your craft.
Mm,
6 years you gave your life to studying.
mm-hmm,
And I'm sure along the way there was thoughts to keep going, right? And maybe there
mm-hmm.
are. The
Right,
PhD is next.
right.
And you go, well, what do I do with that? Right? I can teach music at a school, which you do. I
Mm-hmm,
can teach music personally or privately to
mm-hmm,
students, which you do. And there's that run that you could possibly become a professor someday, which may happen
mm-hmm,
at a university. And then there's other performance opportunities. And one of the things V3 is hoping to do is, and I'll just say it on the podcast, like the big long term aim is for us to establish a conservatory that
yes.
has working artists of your caliber who have a deep, deep faith and a deep, deep understanding of the tradition of Christian faith and art,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
and are using their gift directly for the glory of God, teaching, making art,
Yes.
lecturing, all of these different things.
Mm,
And I'm so proud of you for the faithfulness in the program. Whether we get to hire you someday to be a full-time artist at the conservatory, we'll see. That's God. God has that in His plan. But that's our hope.
mm-hmm,
And I'm so excited. And I think everybody who's been impacted by your music feels both of those things.
mm-hmm,
You have a deep love for God,
mm-hmm.
and you have a deeply developed, really, really wonderful gift.
Mm.
And when those two things are both there, you get somebody who loves God and has given themselves to disciplining their craft and their
Mm.
art, extraordinary things happen. We saw it with Emily Pastor with her painting. We see it on nights of worship where you lead worship, and it's not just beautiful because it's true, but it's truly beautiful. I
Mm.
mean, those moments just they open up the opportunity for you to wondrously experience God in a beautiful way. I want to ask you about that with your faith. I'm Zach Elliott, Executive Director of VUVIVO, and we exist to express the life and beauty of the gospel in the world. Together with our partners, we are wondrously revealing Christianity and inviting people to know God personally. Our team accomplishes that work faithfully through art, literature, music, content, and immersive experiences. And right now, there's a tremendous opportunity to lead with beauty in holding out the hope of the gospel. And I want to invite you to partner with us in that important work. Go to vuvivo.com/support to partner with us to express the life and beauty of the gospel.
Mm.
Because you grew up in the church, around the church, faith was a part of your home and your life. When was the moment for you that you really realize? I love this question that Jesus asks. He talks to his disciples and he takes a moment and he turns toward one of them and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And it becomes remarkably intimate between this disciple and Jesus. And Jesus is saying, "What about you?" And, as he's walked with Jesus and he's gotten to see Jesus, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Answer that question. Like, who do you say he is, and how did you arrive at that
Mm.
conviction? Right? That it wasn't just
Yes.
out there for you, but it's like, no, if somebody asked me that, I'd say this, and here's how I arrived at that.
That's a very good question, too. I think that for me as a child, I grew up in a Baptist church and it had the traditional altar calls and, raising the hands and
Sure.
all of this. And I think I was 5 years old when I was in my home church at the time. And the pastor gave a message on salvation and had every head bowed, every eye closed. Um, who wants to make that commitment to give their life to Jesus? So I, at that little age, raised my hand. I was very excited because both of my parents were, encouraging me in that direction. Um, but I made that decision in that church service. And I remember going home and we had this giant, like red leather bound Bible on the fireplace. And my dad went over there and was like, "We're going to put your name in here and the date in here." So we did that.
Mm.
And I remember just being so, like, almost bound to that name being there. And I think at that moment, I was seeing God as Savior, but Savior from eternal hell or
Sure.
Savior from damnation. And out of somewhat fear, making that decision. And I didn't have quite that personal connection at that age, but I made that commitment.
Mm.
So after that, when the pastor would ask in church, "Does anyone have doubts about their salvation?" Sometimes he would say that. And I remember even at that age, still raising my hand, like, "I'm not sure. I just don't know. Am I saved? I don't know. I'm not sure." I would go back and look at the Bible. I would see my name there, like, "Oh, it's there. So I must be."
Mm.
But I think those doubts really did creep in. And I think for me, there was a progression of getting to know God. And when somebody says, how did you come to salvation or come into that relationship with God? For me, it was a continual journey of getting to know God as different parts of who he is. I think that was the initial meeting.
Yeah.
But then as life went on, you know, I remember even at a very young age, um, whenever my parents would argue, and there were those moments, I remember just running to the Lord in my own
Mm.
room and praying to him as a father. Because I remember reading those passages, like, I guess I can call on him as my father. And so I would sing to him, and I just felt his love surrounding me. I felt his fatherly love. And going through different hard times as a young child, I think God just started to reveal himself in his different aspects of his character to me as father. And then as a little older, I remember going through some friend issues, like not having a lot of friends. And as friend,
Mm.
you know, and I think even to this day, God continues to show himself to me in different parts of himself and who he is. And he's just so great and mighty and incredible. I mean, it's going to be a lifetime and I still won't know him fully until we are face to face. So, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I think, and I love where you started too. Sometimes people in the church, out of the church, our own experience, we can look back on those moments where it was like, was it out of fear that I
Right.
knew God first out of fear? And we can be sheepish to even say that, but I would say like, well, yes, there can be an unhealthy version of anything, but also I think everybody remembers the first time. Not everybody's had that experience, but if you've had the experience where you have tiptoed to the edge of the ocean and it's massive and you are terrified.
Mhm.
It's enormous and you are rightly afraid,
Mhm.
right? And I remember that with the Pacific Ocean, just being at the edge of it and it's smashing against these cliffs and you are like it's equal part beautiful and you want to kind of leap into it, but you also want to run from it. It's all of that.
Mhm.
And I think, yes, God is ineffably, mysteriously, He is God and we are
Mm.
not. And when you
Mhm.
encounter God or you talk about God, if you're talking about God rightly, it should unsettle you. And there
Mhm.
should be a part of us that's like, whoa, Lewis, He's not
Mm.
safe, but He's good, right?
Right.
And then, right, anybody who's dipped their foot in the ocean or been curious enough to get into it or to get
Mm.
into a boat and venture out, you start to have an intimacy with the sea.
Mhm.
And now you're swimming in that mystery, and that mystery is not less terrifying, but it's you
Mhm.
know it, and you
Yes.
start to become personally immersed in this reality, and that thing that is never too familiar is more familiar.
Right.
And I think of then the person who is brave enough to walk out onto the water
Mm.
and they surf and they are feeling themselves being pushed and propelled and almost just enjoying the massiveness of that same ocean that they were
Mm.
terrified by. Right. So
Yes.
I love your progression
Yeah.
that, like, that is true. And
Mm.
you may, people listening, go, yeah, I was terrified as a kid, like God,
Mhm.
and that I could be separate from God. Yes, that's real.
Mhm.
And he will also reveal that he is so that, and he will come so
Mm.
near to you.
Yeah.
And that's what's amazing. I think that's what, on the other side of that, who do you say that I am? This is why people were like stunned by Jesus. And when we say the vision is Jesus, that's the most just believably amazing thing that God would take on flesh. And then you would have a moment where you go, oh, you are I am in the flesh. I mean, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. And I think that's again why art is such an important thing, because how do you paint that?
Mm.
How do you sing about that? How do you speak about
Mm.
God who is both that and this?
Mhm.
For you, when you sit down to the piano and
Mhm.
you allow God to just animate your life and your being,
Mm.
how do you how do you balance that idea of performance and worship and your
Mhm.
own personal encounter with God? I've always been curious for artists who are aware of the technical craft. I want to do this with my highest and best. And I have an audience of one. God is who I am aiming to please or to worship. And yet I'm doing it corporately. There's other people
Mhm.
and I'm aware of them. And then I'm personally in that moment as
Mhm.
well. Just unpack that. Like for you, when you're in those moments, what's happening? And yeah.
Mm. So, I think that it's such a hard balance to strike, to be honest. And I think when you first step into, especially classical training, it's very easy to lose sight of the worship aspect, um, or even, you know, just lose sight of the music itself even. You get so hung up on the correct notes, the correct rhythms, the correct fingering, the correct, the interpretation of this particular, period of music. It can be so technical. Um, and I actually remember when I was performing and preparing for my, um, I think it was my bachelor's recital, and I was playing a Beethoven sonata. And a dear friend of mine who has now passed away, he was Jewish, and he was listening to me practice. And I was playing for him because he was a musician as well, music teacher, studied in Miami, and had come to Tampa. And through a mutual friend, I had met him. And he heard me practicing, and I was playing what I thought was my very best. So I finished, and he looked at me. He's like, "Shauna, you're a very religious person, aren't you?" And I'm like, "Well, yes, faith is very important to me." So he's like, "Yeah, I thought I knew that about you." He said, "Do you see you playing this sonata as worship?" And I was like, I mean, at the time,
Mm.
I wasn't really thinking about that.
Mm.
And it took him saying that for me to realize that I had gotten so hung up on within those 4 years of study, I lost sight of this is also my worship.
Mm.
And he said, "Can you play it again and this be your act of worship?" And I was like, "Okay."
Mm.
And it switched my whole perspective of playing the piano,
Mm.
of playing classical piano specifically, because I was almost separating them in my mind at that point.
Mhm.
Like, okay, I'm just going to get through this and I'm going to get ready for this
Mm.
recital and
Mm.
memorize this. And he just flipped that for me.
Mm.
Um, and that to me just it changed everything. When you view what you're playing as your act of worship and let go of all of the minutia,
Mm.
then it becomes so much deeper.
Mm.
And of course, you're still going to have to play the details. You're going to have to sit in the practice room and, play these 10 measures 20 times or play with the metronome. You still have to get into the technical learning of it. But I think even in that process can still be seen as an act of worship. And I was saying that to one of my students today, actually, a little fifth grader who
Mm.
had came into my
Mm.
studio, and she's learning a recital piece. And I was asking her, how are you feeling about piano? She had just started. This was her first semester learning piano. And it's a high pressure environment at the school where I'm working for the children to prepare for their recital. They have to play for the other teachers, and it can be challenging. And she was like, I like the piano. And I knew she has a church background. So I was talking to her about worship music, and I was like, I know this recital
Mm.
piece is not a worship song, but I passed that on to her. I said, you can even view this as your act of worship, Maddie. And even this little piece that you're playing. And she was like, really? She's like, I never thought of that.
Yeah.
So I'm like, if I had heard that younger, I think it would have changed a lot of things about even at that younger age in my teens when I was like, yeah, I don't think I'm going to pursue
Mm.
classical music. But no, even that.
Yeah. Oh, you have touched right to the core of something so important. So thank
Mm,
you for that. I didn't know you were going to go there.
mm,
Even when I was thinking about that experience of you worshiping and what that must be like and how do you do that, but you diagnosed the symptom of the modern age
mm,
and in Christianity in the West that you said it's separate, it's divided, fragmented. And so there's a sacred part of my life and there's a secular part of my life.
mhm.
And these things are for God and these things are not. And these are the mundane things, these are the sacred things.
Right.
And the story is whatever we eat or whatever we do, whatever we drink, whatever we do it to the glory of God.
Mm,
We're made to be people who are loving God back with all of our mind, soul, heart, strength, all of it, right?
mm-hmm.
This is what we say, like life to the full, the vision is Jesus. Once you start to see through that lens, you go, oh, wow,
Mm,
my practice is worship.
Yes.
my fingers raised, not lowered, that is worship. It's me being who I was made to be. And there's an
Mhm.
excellence, not for the sake of performance or for some external measure, but that the aim of my life is this beautiful return back to the God who gave me that life. This is the great sculptors of old and the great painters of old and the great architects and cathedral builders. They
Mhm.
weren't building for you and I.
Right.
They were building for God, and then we got to benefit from it. And right there is like, for God's glory. And what do you get? The good of man, right? Like,
Oh,
if we
yes.
aim for the glory of God with an Excel spreadsheet, and I
Mhm.
make that thing for the glory of God, then my company is, then that ship, that sea rises that whole ship, right? And
Mhm.
so now Bank of Tampa is better for it because you have somebody worshiping through keystrokes, right?
Mhm.
That's the beautiful vision that that re-enchants practice,
Mhm.
right? And it's not this for that.
Right.
It's integral. It's no,
Mhm.
whatever I eat, whatever I drink, whatever I do it for the glory of God. And this is where I think Hopkins, everything is charged with the grandeur of God,
Right.
right? Ah,
Oh, so good.
I love that that's the way that you approach it with your students.
Mhm.
And I think that's one of the things for as raising up new artists and young artists to develop them with that kind of vision. What would you say to people who are worshipers with you in the church? Because
Mm.
much of your art is in the sphere of church and
Mhm.
worshiping corporately together in that venue, not just worshiping privately or through your practice. When we're worshiping corporately,
Mm.
what are a couple of things that you have learned that you think are important or helpful for that maybe have been lost or we've underattended to in terms of our posture as worshipers in a corporate
Mm.
setting, right?
That's a good
Because sometimes we think so much about, well, it's me, and I'm at the center of it, and it's my relationship with, yes,
Mhm.
and there is something beautiful about corporate worship.
Mm.
So, just from your sacred studies background, from your life as a worshiper, unpack that a little bit. What are a couple things that maybe we haven't thought enough about when it comes to corporate worship?
Oh, that's a good question. I think in corporate worship, it can be so easy as worshipers, or not only in the congregation, but also as a part of a worship team, or to be, I think, overly overly judgmental, overly strict, overly eh, I think we tend to approach, because it is a sacred space and we want it so badly to be sacred. I was just talking to a friend of mine who she got her DMA from Cambridge. Actually, she got her PhD in musicology from Cambridge. My bad. Um, and she studied there, and she was talking about like the history of the church, and we were kind of discussing that in music specifically in the church. And just over time, even St. Augustine, you look through the readings of the early church, the writings of the early church fathers, and how much was written about music.
Mm, yeah.
So much was written. And oftentimes it was fear of, oh, if you bring this instrument in, or if you sing in this way, or if you um, play with these rhythms, you are approaching something evil
Mhm.
and it's not sacred anymore. There's a lot of fear around how we worship in church from a historical perspective all the way to today.
Sure.
I think that we can tend to, even in the church today, we can tend to have that same fearful mentality of, okay, this is a new type of music, or this is a new instrument. Should it be in church? And or this is a type of singing that, or classical music even, there's all of these questions. And I think that it is such a hard topic to go towards, but I think as worshipers, as the church, we need to be open to the Holy Spirit, to what is the Spirit leading us to do. I think in general, I tend to prefer very reverential services that have a lot of I think, classical elements. I love that.
Mm.
But then I think there are people who worship in a more contemporary setting, and I think that is worship as well. I think that the what we should be careful of is that kind of um, thing creeping into where it becomes about what I like and what I don't like, or what I am used to or what I'm not used to. And I mean, I think there's so much that we can study about that topic. And it's something I've been very passionate about because all growing up, that was always the question.
Mm.
Should I be playing this in church? Should I be playing this way or that way? I was raised in a very conservative environment. So even certain rhythms were seen as this is not a correct rhythm. You have too much syncopation here or here. And I think for me, God had to set me free from that mentality because I was starting to have that judgmental spirit towards other people and
Sure.
how they worshiped.
Yeah.
And so I think it's going to be an age old
Yeah.
question, but from the standpoint of a worshiper in the congregation, um, I would just encourage congregations who are standing there singing or listening to music to just be open to what the Spirit is speaking to your heart, and think about how he's ministering not only to you but to the person next to you, the people within that congregation, maybe if you're visiting. Um so yeah.
Yeah. No, I love it. I was thinking when you were talking about right at the end there, what a moment between God and neighbor,
Mhm.
right? Like if the mark of the Christian, John's gospel says, they will know you're my disciples by the way you love one another. What a beautiful lens to look at worship as this is the moment where I am loving God back
Mhm.
with my neighbors.
Mhm.
And how do I rightly enter both of those spaces? And
Mm.
it's not about my preference, maybe it's about the fact that this child can sing with me, or that
Yes.
that person is being able to express their gift, right? Maybe
Mhm.
it's not, right? So
Oh, for sure.
I love that. We're going to run out of time. I could just keep
Yes.
asking because I love these moments. And so many times as you're leading worship for V3,
Mm.
I have these thoughts and I'm like, we're so fortunate to have artists
Mm.
like the artists at V3, Wendy and Megan and yourself, who are thinking so deeply about God and their craft and art, and then offering
Mm.
that as a gift, uh, both in culture, making art, and then also back to the church. And one of our
Mhm.
hopes is that there will be more opportunity for churches to call V3 and say, hey, we'd love for one of your V3 artists to come and to help educate or worship with us or any of those different aspects. So that's the aim, and we're moving in that direction for people who are thinking about art and faith, and they're listening to this conversation and they're saying, oh, wow, I never thought of it that way.
Mhm.
Why is art important to our life of faith? Just from your perspective as an
Mm.
artist, like and you've learned a lot just along the way at V3 too. But if
Yeah.
somebody asked you that question, they said, Shauna, yes, it's good, but it's not essential. Why would you
Mm.
say, no, art is deeply important to our life of faith?
Mm. Well, I think art for me, and I think for believers, it is so essential because, like we talk about at V3, it it uniquely uncovers enchanted reality, as we've talked about, in a way that I think other mediums cannot. I think there's something special about art that links us to the creator, who is an artist in himself. And the way that we express that through music, through painting, through poetry, it just opens a door that I think a lot of other things do not. It allows that the creator to flow through us and to actually um, kind of lift the veil, as we've talked about, to a heavenly world in a way that's inspiring.
Mm,
And I think I've seen that happen. It's not just saying it.
mm,
I've seen it with people who maybe talking to them or giving them a book or explaining the Christian walk. it falls on deaf ears. But when you play a piece of music or you show them a piece of art, there's an open door there. There's a receptiveness.
Mm,
And I think it just ministers to that person in a way that words and even sometimes preaching cannot, because the art itself is preaching, and it softens hearts.
mm,
And so I'm very passionate about art, and I think even when we went on the immersive
sure.
experience to Chicago together, and I started to allow myself to listen to God's voice as I'm standing in front of a painting. I had never done that
Mm,
before. And I had some friends that were very critical about that. And they're like, is this even possible? But as we actually got to experience what God can say through a piece of art, it spoke to me in ways that I have never
mm,
heard God's voice before.
mm.
And so I mean, I just could go on, but I think
Yeah.
it's incredible to see that how art can do that.
Yeah. No, it's so beautiful. One of my favorite quotes from there's a church father. There's a quote from Tertullian that says,
Mhm.
uh, "If I show you a rose, you won't doubt God anymore." That's paraphrasing it. But what a beautiful like if you've ever buried your nose in a rose that's fully in bloom, there's something that you know in a way that isn't just knowing about the definition of it. You're experiencing it personally. And I think that's for V3. We say we want to wondrously reveal Christianity. I think
Yes.
sometimes, especially in the West, we're just so familiar with what we think the Christian faith is.
Mhm.
And Lewis writes about this with reenchantment and on bikes. And he says, you know, you start out as a kid and you have this thing and it's wondrous to you. And then you find yourself all of a sudden discarding that old bike and you walk away from it. And then at some point down the road, you pick it up again and you find yourself riding down a hill and you remember something that you had forgotten. We talk about that with
Mhm.
poetry a lot. It's a way of remembering what it would impoverish us to forget. And I
Mhm.
think for V3, one of our hopes is to wondrously reveal the Christian faith so that even if you have grown up in it, around it, you think you've heard it, know it, you might turn back to something that was very familiar for you or that you have heard about for the first time but been suspicious of. And then you might know God personally. And you're helping us do that in remarkable ways. So we're in your debt,
Praise
and I want
God.
to honor your time. But Shauna, thank you for your work, for the 6 years and a lifelong investment you've made to develop your craft, for your love of God, and just for the sacrifice that you make to serve as a V3 artist. We're in your debt and we think the world of you. So
Aw,
thank you.
thank you. I feel the same about you guys, and what an honor it has been to be able to sit here and talk to you about this. It's one of my favorite topics to think about and to talk about. So thank you.
Yeah. Well, you can all join us in prayer for, we always say, here's to what we can't yet see. And so maybe someday we'll have these from the conservatory and we can all get together there. Until then, we'll come back.